Hello and welcome to the Osborne Group chat. My name is Laurel McCombs. I'm the Senior Philanthropy Advisor with the Osborne Group. We are a nonprofit philanthropy and nonprofit management consultancy working with clients all over the country from different parts of the sector, and just really excited to be here with you today, and really excited because I have my good friend Allison Adcox with me here today from the Nonprofit Association of Oregon, and she's here today to chat with me a little bit about board development, our favorite topic, something that I think every nonprofit could use some help with. And so really excited to hear from Allison today. Allison, you want to introduce yourself and say hi to the folks?
Sure. Thanks for having me. My name's Allison Adcox, as Laurel said. I'm the Director of Learning and Resources at NAO. I've been there for over 8 years now and worn lots of different hats in my time at NAO, and I'm a long-time nonprofit administrator. So I've been working in the sector, working for nonprofits since I was in my 20s and pursuing my college degree, but volunteering since I was about 16. So I'm one of those folks that got scooped up by a nonprofit when I was fairly young and just fell in love with serving a mission and being involved in charitable works. And I feel really honored to be working at the State Association, particularly during this really challenging time. NAO does work around advocacy. We do professional development trainings across the state of Oregon. We do a lot of convening and bring nonprofits together. And so over this last few months, we've just been doing everything that we can to get information, tools, and resources into the hands of as many nonprofit leaders as we can so that they can weather the complex challenges in front of us.
Awesome. We've been, kind of rejuvenating these Osborne Group chats and thinking about people who we could have come on and be guests. And for people who've been checking out the chats, you've seen some different faces pop up. And I knew immediately that I wanted Allison to come be a guest. And Nonprofit Association of Oregon does so many different things. I thought, wow, like she could talk about just about anything. But the last time you and I talked, we had a really lengthy discussion about boards and about some of the challenges that people face with boards. And I know that you've got some really interesting data also around boards that NAO has pulled together. And so I thought, you know what, if I could have, hopefully this is not the last time you join me for a chat, because I think we have lots more to talk about beyond this, but I thought if I could pick one thing that I really want Allison to come chat with me about is its board stuff. So I know that NAO's done some surveying and some really interesting data has come back about boards, at least in the state of Oregon. What are you seeing, and what are some of the insights that you've picked up based on some of that data?
Sure. Well, the data that we were talking about, and the timing was interesting because we were actually traveling back from Southern Oregon from a workshop that you did on board. It was a culture of philanthropy training. And so we were just talking a lot about boards as they stood in the beginning of March. And we had just released, as a state association, a state of the sector survey for Oregon. And one of the factors that we looked at was board effectiveness. As you know, how a board conducts its business is really traditionally an indicator of overall organizational health. Mm-hmm. And so in looking at the results of that data, keep in mind this was done in the latter part of 2019 and released in the beginning of 2020, we saw that 96% of our respondents rated their boards as being effective. Interestingly, only 73% said that they had a high level of satisfaction with the board effectiveness. So that figure just intrigues me. And another interesting piece of data that came out of that was that nearly 26% of the respondents said that they had to postpone, cancel, or end a board meeting because they didn't have a quorum. Mm-hmm. So when I think about boards and what our board's fundamental roles are in supporting our charitable works, active participation and being there is a big part of it. So I'm intrigued by that data. That particular sort of line of data just struck my interest. I have some ideas about what that might mean, but I think as we look at where we are now post COVID-19, it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of our next sort of run of surveys and analysis. We're working with Portland State University right now on a recovery survey. And so we're going to be hopefully getting that data out. And you know, I think what we know was true coming into COVID was that boards felt they had some work to do. Leaders felt their boards had some work to do around effectiveness, and this is around their basic legal responsibilities. So, you know, if you came into the COVID crisis and you didn't have your fundamentals in place, you're going to want to do that real quick or get real serious about that really quickly, because there's no time for dysfunction on boards right now. And so we're really conscious that we're looking at what we can do to support boards that have to quickly kind of get their fundamentals covered, whether that's, you know, a board member who's new to the board, who never got sort of the orientation of what are the basic legal responsibilities of board service, how does this board organize itself and come together, if you don't have board agreements, and sort of expectations around how much time you're spending on a board. If your board members aren't showing up for whatever reason, no judgment on that. We know in some of the smaller rural communities, people are on all of the boards in the community. And so, you know, that's something that we all have to kind of move through. My hope is that with everybody suddenly being virtual, that is increasing our options for coming together. I know we're experiencing a lot of creativity coming out across the communities in Oregon, a lot of community-based organizations that are helping the nonprofits in their regions to adopt platforms like Zoom so that they can have effective board meetings in a new way. And who knows, maybe that even helps people overcome some of the challenges they had. I know as a working parent, I love virtual meetings because it's a lot easier for me to construct my day around a virtual engagement than it is actually having to transport to something. But yeah, I'm going to be keeping an eye on that line of data as we look at what comes back from the recovery survey that we're doing. But yeah.
It is, you made an interesting comment about kind of any challenges that we had before are almost just kind of amplified now during COVID and everything that's happened. And I feel like that's been true, not just of boards, but of all of our operations in our nonprofits, right? Whether it be our HR practices or our accounting practices, or even our getting acknowledgement letters out, right? Like every kind of process and system and piece of culture in our organizations has it's almost like we got like the curtain pulled away during COVID, and any challenges we already had just have been amplified, which I think, to your point, in some ways is a great thing, right? Like not always a bad thing to pull the curtain back a little bit and say, you know, we were getting by, we were kind of succeeding in spite of ourselves, and maybe we need to tighten some of those things up. But what, I mean, just in terms of boards, like what, you mentioned meetings, you mentioned attendance, things like that, but what are some of the other things that you're seeing, challenges that you're seeing organizations having specifically with their boards that are really coming to light now with COVID?
Mm-hmm. I think just broadly, the uncertainty. I mean, this is not the disaster I think those of us who were planning for and creating contingency plans for, in Oregon, you know, we often think of, you know, what would happen if there was an earthquake. And so we know that some organizations have been doing planning around emergencies, but not a global pandemic, and coupled with economic crisis and social and political unrest, and you know, folks having not being able to actually come together in person. The fundamental sort of way that we know how to be in community is changing. So I think that uncertainty is really hard to, you know, in the best of circumstances, it would be difficult to go through a planning process as a board and staff. And certainly we're under, you know, some really unprecedented pressures right now. And one has to hope that people focus on what's most important. So as I think about boards, just to break it down to the fundamentals, it can get messy in the details, but you're a steward of the public trust, you're a steward of charitable dollars, and you're a steward of the organization's mission. So when you're facing these challenges and working, if you have a staffed organization and you're working with your executive director or your leadership teams, really staying focused on your role as the board and how can you support staff in their role, so that they can be as effective as possible. Because that uncertainty is something that everybody is faced with right now. And we know that people are being faced with a flood of critical decisions that the board needs to be involved in. People who were able to take advantage of the Paycheck Protection Program, having to sign off on loans and things that you may not have really had to do before. Boards need to really be thinking about, how do we know that we have our risk management in order? Simple just assessments that you can look at. Do we have the right insurance? Do we have the right financial controls in place now that we might have folks working virtually? Have we looked at where are there places in our organization that we could have we need to have duplication of knowledge, like somebody needs to know how to deposit money into the bank, and who's doing what when, and who's reviewing it and signing off. All of those things are important to do. So it's just time to, if you haven't opened that junk drawer, you got to open that junk drawer. You got to take a look at what's in there and get rid of the stuff that doesn't suit you going forward, and organize what you have, and lean into the volunteerism, the spirit of volunteerism that brought your board members to your mission, and get creative about and continue to build relationships with folks who can support you. There's been just a phenomenal effort from folks like the Osborne group and all of the different thought leaders that we work with, who are putting out great tools and resources to help nonprofit boards and executives navigate these challenges. I know NAO as a state association is trying to curate and disseminate that information out to all of our members. So be sure to take a look and see who your state association is. And if you're not already a member of your state association, it's really helpful to be in peer community with fellow nonprofits. We might, I've heard the analogy that we're all weathering the same storm, but we might not all be in the same boats, right? But we might as well share information with one another. And if you can borrow a tool from a colleague organization that will help you, your board can help in those regards, making those connections. And so I think I might have gone off of your question, but
no, it's all good.
you know me, that's what I do.
So I want to go back to something you said that's really struck me in the last couple weeks, especially, which is kind of this spirit of volunteerism, this spirit of people wanting to not just get involved, but actually wanting to do something that makes a tangible difference. I think that has been something that we all have gotten out of the last, out of everything that's going on in the world is, I've always said, even before COVID and before 2020, I have often said that nobody joins a board to be ineffective, right? Like there's nobody that wakes up in the morning and says, you know what, I want to go volunteer for somebody and not do helpful things and be irritating and cause headaches for staff. Like nobody does that, right? Like everyone who joins a board does it, I think, from a place of really good intent. I think that there's a whole host, and you and I could probably talk for 5 hours about all the reasons why that good intent doesn't always result in actually, really tangible, helpful, meaningful work. Right. But I think most people who join boards have really good intent for doing something good. I think even, and now more so, I think people want to be able to make a real difference in the organizations that they see are making a real difference in our communities and in our world. And I keep coming back to this idea of board engagement, right? That, as we, I remember when the first 6 weeks of COVID, kind of that March, April time period, I started hearing from a lot of organizations. There were essentially kind of two types of organizations, right? There were the organizations who I think took a lot of learnings from the Great Recession of the late aughts of 2007, 2009 and said, we are not going to cut development staff. We are going to move, we're not going to cut our resource generators. We're going to, maybe make some tough cuts in other places, but we're going to keep moving forward, trying to raise the money we need to raise. And then there were the other organizations who kind of said, all right, where can we make cuts? Right. Mm-hmm. That was the first place that the board went was, right. All right, well, send me your budget that shows a 5% cut, a 15% cut, and a 30% cut. Right. Mm-hmm. And it becomes that, like, I wish we could measure that, right? Like, that's such interesting data in and of itself. Like, which side of that where was your board, right? Uh-huh. For an organization to say, was my board one of the ones that said, we're going to figure out how we get through this first, and then if we have to make cuts, we'll do that if necessary, versus the boards that just went straight to cuts, right? And I think, what was it fundamentally that made those two sets of boards so different from each other? And I keep going back to board engagement, right? Like, those boards, and to your point about the fundamentals, orientation, right? Like, boards who and I loved what you said about, like, kind of this being good stewards of the mission, of the community, of the people you serve, all of that. Like, boards who really get that are the ones who aren't willing to just take the cuts, right? Versus the boards that aren't as engaged, don't really understand their role or their responsibilities. They're the ones who are like, oh, okay, well, CEO, just send me a budget and show me what that looks like if we made 20% cuts across the board, right?
Right. I know. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I mean, so what, your perspective on what you're seeing in terms of kind of the different way that boards are responding to this, and how do we get our boards to be board A, right? Like, how do we get more board A's and less board B's, right?
Right. Well, philosophically, I think organizations, and we're all having to do slightly different things. And certainly cuts are something you have to think about in a situation like this. I know a lot of organizations had to make the difficult decision early on to either lay off or furlough staff, or kind of go into a little bit of program hibernation. Other nonprofits are, their services are in high demand, and they're having to figure out how to ramp up to do more in this new context where there has to be protective, masks and cleaning procedures and caution around disease spread, right? So when I think about board engagement, what we saw right out of the gates was a lot of organizations that were in, I'm not calling out arts and environment, but that was just what I noticed anecdotally, groups that were sort of saying, I don't know if our mission is relevant right now. I'm not sure about, asking for donations right now, or what I should be doing as a board member other than just kind of supporting the staff. And every thought leader that we've had the honor to work with, yourself included, over the last 3 months has been saying, now is not the time to halt your efforts on fundraising. By all means, if you have to consider cuts, that's something you need to look at. But be out there fundraising. And in the session that you did with our constituents, if you don't have a table of gifts, make one, because every organization that does relies on individual giving needs to have a table of gifts. And maybe you haven't had a major gift before, but you might be able to get one right now with some creative coordination with your board. I know that's where I go to. I'm not somebody who's worked in fundraising specifically, but I've worked in so many different roles and worked with boards. Your boards are often the folks that have relationship with people that in your community. And as a board member, you want to be able to speak to the programs and services and the value that they have in community. Maybe you're not the person to make the major gift ask, but you know how to make the introduction. I think right now is a time to look to who's the person leading the organization. So let's assume it's your staffed organization. There's an executive director. I think as both staff and board need to line up in support of their EDs right now and make sure that they're supported in their way of leading, that they have what they need. We can end up with board engagement that like overreaches and starts doing the work of staff. I don't think that's what you're describing, but that's sometimes how the good intentions show up, is asking lots of questions of staff and wanting reports so that they can make good decisions. And so finding,
and we can't, sorry not to interrupt, but I mean,
yeah,
we can't be afraid of that, right? I do think
right.
that that's one of the things that keeps people from engaging their boards more actively, is the fear of micromanaging, of kind of over involvement, of getting, not wanting to deal with, all the questions or the nitpicking. And I think as staff, it means it's got to be a two-way street. If we want our boards to be more engaged and do the things that we want them to do, we have to be transparent, and we have to be open to having conversations that maybe we don't want to have with them. And that's just kind of the give and take of all this.
Right, right. So I also think that there was a great blog post that I think it was Ann Walstead from Board Source put out, and the analogy just hit me because I had never thought about it this way, but it was like, what other team sport do you have where you are, game time is every meeting. Every meeting you have a collection of leaders who are coming together and playing the game. It's game time. And so whatever boards can do to build their capacity to be effective in game time, that's what struck me about that blog post. I was like, well, no wonder it's such a difficult thing to do. And when you think about, the sort of life cycle of organizations, right? When we're at our genesis, not all of us maybe start out as all volunteer organizations, but if we start out as all volunteer organizations out of a heart-centered mission center, the board is doing the work of the programs. And then at some point it becomes a staffed organization and you have to step back, and it's fascinating to me that we're effective ever at all with how much we have to do. And, I am not on a board currently, and someday I will step into board service, but I think boards that have clarity, they know their corporate rules, they orient themselves, annually. Just because you're not a new board member doesn't mean you don't need to review your state guidelines for what your legal requirements are. Read your bylaws, look at them. That's your corporate rules. Follow them. If they don't fit, revise them, make them work. And if you have conflict, surface it and deal with it, including with the ED. Like, we have to be comfortable having healthy conflict within our organizations. I don't know about other areas, but in Oregon and in Portland, and I'm from here, so I'm talking about my hometown. There's a lot of, being nice, like people have a hard time having direct conflict, right? And I'm not talking about arguing in board meetings, but disagreeing with one another, right? Bring it out into the surface, have a process that allows for inclusive participation, honor people's contributions, but move the work forward.
Oh, such great advice, Allison. I think, the one thing we really didn't have time to talk about today that I think maybe this is a whole topic for another day, but I think a lot of boards right now, in the wake of George Floyd's death and the Black Lives Matter movement and everything that's been happening in the last couple of weeks, I think there are a lot of boards that are either having or really need to have some tough conversations about a whole myriad of issues facing their organizations, right? Whether it be, again, kind of HR policies or programmatic policies or their own board makeup, right? And kind of what does diversity and equity and inclusion mean to us in the nonprofit sector? What does it look like across our sector, but also just really specifically within each and every one of our organizations? These are not easy conversations to have for anybody, but they're absolutely necessary conversations. And we're only going to get there, to your point, if we have the basics in place where we know how to have those tough conversations. We're engaged with each other enough to feel like we're safe to have those conversations with one another, and that we all keep the mission of our organizations at our focus and what we're trying to accomplish for our communities, and know that our intentions are good, and that we're trying to do the best we can for the people we serve and for our community. So, it's so much more to talk about. I feel like we could just keep talking forever, but we'll kind of end it with that. I want to say thank you so much for joining me today and all of your insights. And I definitely hope you come back again and we can talk more. We'll come back after you guys do the recovery survey. I'd love to hear
that sounds great.
More about what you learned from that. And again, just thanks to you and to Nonprofit Association of Oregon, and all that you're doing for the sector, and especially during these really tough and challenging times. You guys are just really stepped up and done really amazing things. So
it's an honor.
Any final thoughts from you?
The thing that our board of directors did, and I'm just going to throw it out there, and I can't tell you how much it meant to me as a person that was working really hard and just trying to keep my own morale up. They sent us handwritten thank you notes. They got together, they figured out how to get our addresses, and they sent us thank you letters for our work. So if you're a board member and you're just stuck, those acts of compassion and checking in with people, building relationships, it's all going to come out of building authentic relationships. So just be present with folks, and keep up the good work. We rely on our boards to be able to be successful. You can have an organization without staff, but you cannot have a nonprofit organization without a board. So we want to see you succeed, and we want to have thriving nonprofits through this crisis. Now more than ever, it's going to be necessary for our sector to come together. So thank you, Laurel. It's so good to see you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today.
Absolutely. Well, and take care, everyone else. And if you're looking for more resources and information, visit theosbornegroup.com, and you have a great day. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.